Are folks ready to get started? Would you like to take your seats? Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Robin Gross with IP Justice, and I'm the organizer of this panel on ICANN accountability. A little background on this topic. ICANN, as you all are well aware, is a organization that manages some critical internet resources with a domain name system, and it is also a private California corporation in terms of its legal entity. And in its bylaws and articles of incorporation, ICANN promises that it will operate in the benefit of the public interest, and that it will operate in a transparent and open and community-driven manner. So then the next question is, well, how do we actually achieve that? What are the mechanisms to ensure that ICANN is accountable to these promises and commitments that the organization lays out in its bylaws, articles, and operating procedures? Well, ICANN has a few different accountability mechanisms. The first would be the reconsideration request. So if somebody feels that a staff or board action or inaction was in violation of these bylaws and these commitments, they can file a reconsideration request to the board to ask the board to reconsider that idea, that decision. And then if they're still unsatisfied with the result of that process, the reconsideration request process, they could then file an independent review panel proceeding and ask that the matter be then taken to an independent review panel for a sort of like an arbitration adjudication. And then that decision would go back to the ICANN board of directors, and they could choose to adopt that decision, or they could choose to ignore it at their discretion. Another one of the ICANN accountability mechanisms is the ombudsman, and we're happy to have him here with us today, Chris Lahat, and so I'll let him talk more about the ombudsman's role in ICANN accountability. So this is just sort of a lay of the land and what we're working with here. What I'd like to do with our discussion today is give each one of our panelists an opportunity for just a few minutes of brief opening remarks, and then I'd like to really open it up for discussion. And I've got some questions for the panelists, but also for the audience. And so I'm really hoping that people will take this opportunity to participate and get in the queue and join in the discussion as well. So without further ado, I should also mention who the workshop co-sponsors were to help make this happen today. CGI.BR and the Internet Governance Project, and the Public Interest Registry, and the Internet Commerce Association, and Internet NZ are the co-sponsors of today's session. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. We've got Larry Strickling here with us today. He's with the USNTIA department. And Larry, why don't you just kick us off with this? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Robin. So that we're heading into a big and broad topic here. So I'd like to, I guess, maybe start off with some observations I have from my experience with one of the accountability mechanisms that ICANN, the Accountability and Transparency Review Team. For those of you who aren't involved day-to-day with ICANN, back in 2009, the United States signed an affirmation of commitments with ICANN, and as part of the commitments ICANN made, they committed to undertaking every 3 years a review of its accountability and transparency. Now understand that this commitment was made on the heels of a whole series of accountability reviews that ICANN had done over the previous years, yet there continued to be a sense that this was an area that might benefit from a true community evaluation, and as a result, we've now had 2 of these accountability and transparency review teams, first one in 2010 and the second one last year, and many of the members of those teams are here. Avri served on last year's team. I see Peter Dengate-Thrush and Chris Despain, who were on the first team, and I'm sure there are others here in the room that I just am not picking out of the crowd as I sit here. I think those have both been very important functions in terms of bringing attention to accountability issues, giving the community a direct opportunity to have input into the accountability process and to review and evaluate the conditions and the recommendations that came out of the teams. I think the first year the team proposed about 28, 29 recommendations, all of which were accepted by the board and all of which have been implemented at one level, I think, or another. And again, our report last year provided an accounting of how well the board had implemented that first set of recommendations. Then last year we came back with yet another set of recommendations that the board is currently in the process of implementing along with ICANN staff. So I think the structure, the model of these review teams has been very good. It's one that I think needs to continue on, and the aspects of it that I particularly want to emphasize are the openness and transparency of the process. Every meeting held of the ATRT was open to the community. It was all the meetings were available to be monitored. Generally, I think by listening, because a lot of our work was by phone calls. We did a tremendous amount of consultation with all of the supporting organizations and advisory committees at the ICANN meetings. We sought input from the community, both in terms of identifying the issues that folks wanted to have addressed, and then after we developed recommendations, we put those out for public comment. So I think it's a good model of openness and transparency, and I think it's led to improved accountability at ICANN.
Thank you very much, Larry. Our next speaker this morning is Pat Kane, representative of VeriSign.
There we go. Thank you, Robin. Good morning. So I'm Pat Kane. I'm at VeriSign, and I have responsibility at VeriSign for 2 components. One is the policy development process within ICANN. My team works in that area, but the other part of my team also implements the results of that policy process. So I'm going to cover a little bit about how we see the process and how we believe accountability can be improved in the future. So ICANN is a multi-stakeholder governance model that develops policy from the bottom up. As a registry operator, we like that because it allows us to directly participate within the consensus building process so that we can have our say in terms of what affects us. And right now, the Thick Who Is process that's going on is a good example of that. So Thick Who Is was determined to be applied to all registry operators, which VeriSign is not a Thick Who Is registry, but because we're affected, we're also participating in the implementation review team. So the whole process is working for us from the bottom up to where we're able to drive the policy and then help with the implementation. It is, however, a messy and sometimes slow process. Who Is taken a long time to get to where it is today, and there's still some issues that remain around Who Is. In 2006 at the San Juan ICANN meeting in Puerto Rico, I met Wolfgang Kleinvector for the first time, and he explained to me in great detail one simple fact, and that was that the more voices that you have to make decisions within a consensus building body, the less gets done. And within ICANN today, there's many more voices today than there were before. We had 3,000 people over 3,000 people at the London meeting. My belief is Los Angeles will extend far beyond that. So does that mean that as we expand and grow in terms of an organization within the community, does that mean that less will get done? I believe that ICANN staff allows this to be used as a reason to drive top-down processes into the policy area or trying to address what amounts to policy questions. I think it's inappropriate. But perhaps it is time to have a discussion about different models and different ways to introduce policy modifications. You know, some issues as it pertains to operational emergencies, viability of the organization, strategic decisions the organization can make for themselves and how they address their customers require outcomes that value speed or are targeted to manage the future of that organization. But those items should not be determined in a random organization serving manner. Let me illustrate. In November of 2000, VeriSign launched IDNs at the second level in .com and .net. The product launch worked really well. As we moved forward, we had a lot of policies put in front of us by ICANN staff and by ICANN staff that were not done throughout the normal process. It didn't allow us to achieve the results early on that we wanted to within IDNs. But what evolved out of that was a bottom-up process that determined and built the registry services evaluation process. That is a really great process that allows registries to determine and bring to market viable products and services that their customers or our distribution partners, the registrars, are seeking to provide to their customers. That policy set, like I said, was developed bottom up. Now today, what we've got is that the ICANN staff is modifying that process in a manner that is changing it for operational efficiencies, because it doesn't work for them today, so that they can do things faster and presumably better to achieve operational excellence. But it's a bottom-up policy that's being modified top-down, and bottom-up policies should be reviewed in a bottom-up manner, much as the ATRT that Larry described. And other examples of that that's going on today through the new GTLD process. The application guidebook was put together. Modifications were made post-consensus driven by the community. And the agreement itself between ICANN and the new GTLD operators had so many modifications that it actually became a negotiation process between ICANN staff and the registry community. And so the people that had contributed to the GNSO, or through the GNSO to that policy, weren't even a part of that process as well. So we're seeing some deviation there. But even though that's going on, there probably is some non-policy things that affect the community that should be top-down. But they should be specific things. It should be a predefined list, things that the community agrees upon, a list of executive powers, or what, with the U.S. Constitution we know as enumerated powers. But should that happen, I don't think the accountability mechanisms that we have in place today will work adequately for that process. ICANN is going to evolve, so must the accountability mechanisms. But what sort of mechanisms should we have? Well, 30 years ago, I started out as a software engineer working on processing Medicaid claims, which is healthcare insurance in the United States. We had things that were edits and we had things that were audits. Edits, checking the data ahead of time, and audits making sure that that data was balanced in terms of what the whole Medicaid program was supposed to do. I see the bottom-up process very much like an edit, in that we check things ahead of time before we ever send policy to the board for approval. But the audit process is really post. And so if you have a top-down process, you really have to take a look at what an audit is and how did it affect things and how did it work. And so what is that audit process that's going to follow on? Larry referred to the AOC. I think the AOC is a tremendous tool that we can use with the ATRT, but we know that the AOC can be terminated 6 months after, or with 6 months notice from either party. So once the IANA transition happens, we either have to have an AOC that has more permanence so that we can have the ATRT part of that, or we have to find some way to pull those processes into the accountability process today. Other things that we could look at and use are auditor generals. I think that's a well-documented way to move forward. Essentially, we have to have some process in place to deliver reports to assess the performance of those that are entrusted with community resources. I think the Del Bianco stress tests would be a great way to determine some of these audit reports, and so that we can measure the organization moving forward. But should we fail in those particular areas and the audits persistently show failure to adhere to the processes, we probably need some additional audit processes on the back end to potentially include censure, election of the leadership of the organization, and maybe even a way to replace any member of the board or all the board, for example.
Thank you very much, Pat. Our next speaker this morning is Gonzalo Navarro from the ICANN Board of Directors. Gonzalo.
Thank you, Robin, and good morning. I was thinking to deliver my statement in Spanish, but I think that's going to be complicated since you are not able to read the screen. Anyway, I'm going to be really brief because I'm interested to have a conversation and engagement with the people in this table and with the remote participation. The accountability and transparency process is not new in ICANN, but I'm really happy to have the opportunity to bring this issue here to the IGF. I think it's important to expand the opportunity for people not related with ICANN to understand and to have more knowledge about what we are doing, how important is this process for our community, and how they can be engaged and involved. Actually, the accountability and transparency process, which is related with the IANA functions work, actually was born here in the IGF, I mean, as a consequence of the WSIS process. So it's interesting, to have the opportunity to revisit this issue, from a different perspective, perhaps with different actors. Having said that, I think that this process is the most important process that ICANN has engaged with, in the last 10 years. Is comprehensive of all the things that we are representing and doing as a multi-stakeholder organization, and is quite a unique opportunity to show to the world, the way we work, how we work, and the goals that we have as an organization and as a community. So, having said that, I think that it's important for us to engage in this kind of dialogue. And I'll be happy to take the answers and to engage with you this morning, about these important topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Our next speaker this morning is Carlos Afonso from CGI.br. Carlos.
Thank you for the invitation, Robin. I am not a rigorous follower of the issue. When I hear that there are 29 recommendations for accountability regarding ICANN, I would like to see those because it's an impressive number of recommendations for an issue. I understand it's an issue for all what I would call the inner stakeholders of ICANN, which are, of course, registries, registrars, the non-commercial organizations who are interested in IP addressing and domain name issues, which are not all of them, is a very small minority of them. But if this is a true multi-stakeholder structure, there is need of a broad consensus on this issue. Because it exists, ICANN cannot say it is not. I have seen declarations from staff which are really amazing. They come to one point to treat IANA as an entity, not as a function. And it's a simple set of tasks. And these issues must be resolved, of course, by broad consensus. There is not a single inner stakeholder of ICANN that is not complaining about this or that facet of accountability. And another thing, which I can gather, is the role of staff vis-à-vis the board, which is, for me, it seems a serious issue which has been object of countless attrition. And I think it's part of the accountability and transparency process that this has to be resolved. And well, I would like also to comment on how the idea of a new relationship to the IANA functions has already progressed in practice. But I'll wait for other people to talk, and then I'll come back to it.
Thank you, Carlos. Our next speaker is Avri Doria, a former member of the ATRT.
Thank you, Robin. When I started looking at accountability, I started figuring out how it is I could actually tell if something was accountable or wasn't. And I find one criteria is that, well, first of all, if a lot of people are talking about accountability, then there may be an issue, because people rarely talk about accountability when something is properly accountable. So you get into a criteria that says, well, in a multi-stakeholder organization, is it the aggregate impression that more people think it is accountable and more people don't. Another way of looking at it is that we get into sort of looking at particular aspects, looking at details of, for example, do processes change without proper change control? Is there a way to audit, as was mentioned? Are there mechanisms? I come out of a fairly analytic philosophical tradition, so I started basically stepping back and looking at it. What are some of the elements that make up accountability? And along what scales can these be measured? Because obviously, the notion of perfect accountability probably doesn't exist, and the notion of there is no accountability, well, that pretty much does exist, but perhaps it doesn't because people can always rise up. And so at some point there is accountability. But in the middle, there's a very big gray space. So when I look at it, I see many elements, but I see essentially three main elements that I start peering into. There's certainly notions of oversight, whether it's hard oversight, soft oversight. Oversight that you must do what you are told versus oversight where you get a recommendation and you can do it or you can opt not to. We have in the AOC, I think, a very brilliant form of soft oversight where we do have a community mostly done in a, inclusive, democratic, so-called bottom-up fashion that we use to give recommendations to a board. And the board may or may not accept them, and when they're implemented, they may or may not be implemented genuinely, or they may be implemented as checklist items. But because the AOC process cycles through, you actually get to come back, and if it's done purely as a checklist, you get to come out. But then again, 6 years have gone by. So that is a very good soft oversight, unenforceable. ICANN obviously has no hard oversight. California law may or may not prohibit that. It may rest on various features of the organization. But by and large, oversight is missing. Oversight also comes in scales of, is it prescriptive oversight that tells an organization what to do? Or is it sort of exception-based oversight where when something goes wrong, there's something? And that goes into sort of the next item I look for, which is the notion of redress. And within ICANN, again, they've been talked about the three possible methods of redress: the reconsideration, the independent review panels, and the ombudsman. Those three methods of redress are middling at best. In terms of the reconsideration, it's really just a process reconsideration for the most part, and it's being reconsidered by the same people who made the decision. So there's a certain element of that makes it difficult to actually have strong faith in a reconsideration process. In terms of the independent review panel, it seems to be a very fine mechanism when you can afford to use it. It is not an accessible mechanism. And again, it is also a voluntary, it is a soft mechanism in that the board can or cannot decide to accept it. And now granted, there is social pressure on the organization to accept or to do something with that. And then there's the ombudsman, which is a very fine mechanism, and we do have the ombudsman here to speak, who looks at the fairness of what goes on, yet has no enforcement capability. So again, it is a good mechanism for identifying when something needs redress. It can suggest redress and such, but it cannot constrain in any sense. And then the final part of it that sort of, in some sense, is the base of it all, is the transparency of the mechanisms. And to that extent, to what degree can we say that ICANN is transparent? Again, I would sort of say it falls sort of in the middle of the scale. Some of the stuff is transparent, a lot of the stuff isn't. Now, the ATRT, too, has made recommendations that everything should be transparent, except for those things that have a specific stated reason for not being so. And the board has indeed agreed to that as something they will implement, But again, it still remains to be seen to what extent that will happen and what manner of it can be. It can happen in a sense that everything is transparent and it's there for you to see, or it can be implemented in, well, if you ask in the right way, with the right forms, with the right procedures, then it can be made visible. So even that is something, so all these things can be measured along scales, and if one really wants to be an analyst, one can go much deeper in dividing the issues. But I tend to think that that's the kind of analysis that we need to be doing, is looking at all these facets, as opposed to most of us are still in the aspect of, yeah, I think it's accountable. No, I don't think it's accountable. And then picking a few things where, you know, we personally focus in on. So that's where I wanted to start. Thanks.
I think another aspect of this discussion on accountability is the ICANN as an institution, which is one of the key institutions so far created for the governance of the internet. It's the governance of the so-called critical internet resources. The ICANN as a political entity as a whole, which is present and very active in political initiatives in the whole internet governance scenario. The Net Mundial story, the Net Mundial initiative, which is now called Global Net Initiative, and so on, which also we have some issues with, and regarding accountability and transparency. So that's another theme of our discussion regarding the whole accountability issue.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Chris Lahat, the ICANN Ombudsman. Please.
Thank you, Robin. The Ombudsman's office is a little bit different from the other accountability mechanisms in that I'm really meant to be the first place you go to if you have a difficulty with the organisation. The role is structured within the ICANN organisation. So in terms of governance and accountability, I'm here for the community, making recommendations to the board, and as Avery pointed out, that can sometimes have the impact of a wet bus ticket. However, and the few times that I have had to make a recommendation, they see the board has accepted what I have suggested. The Ombudsman's office has been looked at rather carefully, and more recently in the ATRT2, and it is proposed that the scope of the office be increased somewhat because of a need for further accountability structures. I'm not sure it's entirely appropriate for me as the present holder of the office to advocate for changes which could conceivably be seen as some form of empire building, but I would be very interested to hear from the community as to specific ways in which the use of my office can enhance accountability. Now, there are a number of different aspects which have been suggested in ATRT2. There have been some comments about it, but not a great deal of debate. It's not the sort of issue where I really want to tell people what I think. I'm very interested in a bottom-up movement for these are the sorts of things that I should be doing or doing in addition to what I'm already doing. So while my principal role is expressed as dealing with issues of fairness and of delay, that has gradually come to encompass issues such as diversity, challenges, and that sort of thing as well. Increasingly, issues such as privacy, the lack of it, or the protections around privacy have also started to be raised. Issues like access to documentation are also important, and that's a mechanism, of course, for ensuring transparency and accountability within ICANN itself. Although, as it happens under my bylaw, I have access to everything my bylaw says that if I request a document from any member of the community, they should give it to me. If they say no, I'm not quite sure what I would do then, but I would certainly make something of a fuss if I regarded that as critical. So my role really depends on the ability to persuade people. It has been described as moral suasion rather than the ability to say, ICANN, you should be doing this or you must do this. And that's pretty typical for an ombudsman. An ombudsman really actually has the power to tell people to do things. Even the national ombudsman don't actually have the power to do much except generally the same sort of power that I have, which is to order that information be provided. The rest of it is all recommendations. So the range of what I do in the new era is something that I'd like the community to think about. Is what I'm doing a wide enough scope? Should it be wider? Should it be more narrow? And I'd like to hear from people because, as Avery said, accountability was something that wasn't really discussed terribly much when I first started doing this work, and it's really only in about the last year, and particularly more focused with the IANA contract issue, that people have started to say, well, how else do we ensure that there is somebody to answer to? So we're in a brave new world, and with that, I welcome contributions.
Thank you very much, Chris. Our final panelist this morning is Jordan Carter from Internet NZ.
Thanks, Robin, and good morning, everyone. This is going to sound a bit bitsy because other people have already said several things I was going to say, so I'm just not going to repeat them to save time. Internet NZ is the designated manager for the .NZ CCTLD, so I'm speaking with a perspective as one of the core customers of the IANA functions, which is an important part of what ICANN does. I just want to start out, why are we having this conversation particularly here? And I'm glad we are. It's because ICANN's accountability is an issue for the whole internet community. It isn't just an issue for the users of the IANA functions or the direct participants in ICANN operation. And that's because those functions are very important to the ongoing stability and security of the internet's operation. And I think that creates a tension in all these accountability operations. On the one hand, you've got customers like me who want the system to work and to know we're not going to be broken or damaged by actions of ICANN. But there is a broader global public interest here that just adds a tension we need to acknowledge. The second point I'd make is that in the current discussion around ICANN accountability that's connected to the IANA stewardship transition, I want to endorse something that Larry Strickling said yesterday morning. We can't overload that process. We can't say, let's fix all of the concerns we might have on every aspect of ICANN's accountability in this one process. But we have to deliver, as part of the IANA stewardship transition, an accountability settlement that all of the key stakeholders can live up to. And because there is contention around the real role or influence of the NTIA's existence and role in terms of accountability, we cannot draw a narrow scope about it. It isn't just saying, replace the contracting function, you'll be fine, or replace the administrative verification function, you'll be fine. So frustratingly for me, who likes things to be precise, we cannot tie down that scope very clearly in advance, but we shouldn't overload the process. The third point is that there is a lot of talk about ICANN accountability, and I want to say I think ICANN's got a cultural problem with accountability. And that is around what is the nature of the public interest. In my conversations with ICANN board members and with ICANN staff, I sometimes form the impression that in some parts of the organization there's a view that they know what the public interest is better than the internet community does, better than ICANN's customers do. Now that's an attitudinal problem that the board and the CEO of ICANN need to tackle head on and shift, because the public interest is served by one coherent internet. It's served by the effective operation of the functions that ICANN is responsible for. And the people who know those best are the customers of those functions. So if the board and staff of ICANN ever get into a situation where they think their community's interest is not aligned with some abstract public interest, they are guaranteed to be wrong, and they need to reconsider where they're coming from. The last point I'll really make, 2 points, is that CCTLDs are different to all of the other participants in this mix. Our country codes are largely matters for national decision. We make policy nationally. We have legal relationships with our governments. Our governments can inevitably get involved within the local internet community to shape our evolution and stuff. And our priority is that ICANN does not come in and screw around with those relationships. We're not like the GTLDs, especially the new ones, which are the creations of the ICANN system. We're not like the numbering and protocol folks who've already got external relationships. And so the CCTLDs are a deeply complicated, political, messy, scrappy situation that cannot be bundled with the G names and cannot be bundled in as just another customer group. The more you look at all of these, the more different they are, and that's important. But I'm just making that point that CCTLDs are going to be complicated in this whole process. And the final point I'd like to raise is that in terms of accountability, there are lots of mechanisms, and one of the risks is that they create overload for the community and trying to pay attention to all the information and so on that's going on. But one of the things that has to be on the table is the way that ICANN is structured internally. There's a bit of a bogeyman out there around structural separation, what that might mean. In the New Zealand case, we've had good experience with separating our registry operator from our policy-making function, from our role in my part of the organization as the overall steward of the DNS. This doesn't involve random contracting relationships. It doesn't involve conspiracies to create cartels and run the system badly. It's about saying that sometimes you need bright lines for accountability. And so one example of that in this evolving discussion could be that you created the IANA functions operator as having its own policy board that had to check and validate that process had been followed before changes could be made to the various parameters, registries, and so on that it controls. Another one might be to extract CCTLD policymaking from being internal to the ICANN framework and making it external. But these structural options are on the table, and they aren't going to go away. And what I'll finish with is that some of the tone of people, particularly in the technical community in this debate, has a "this is ours, get your hands off, you don't know what you're talking about" culture. And I'd like to finish by saying that as we have this discussion, not only here but in the ICANN community, people have to be prepared to reevaluate where they're coming from. They have to be prepared to say, yes, I've been involved with this system since before it started, but the internet has got a lot more users than it did in the late 1990s. It's a lot more important to all of us, and it's got to be a broad-based, open conversation. So that's all. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you very much, Jordan, and all our other panelists this morning for getting us started. I'd like to kick us off now with some dialogue amongst the table, the panelists, and also welcome the audience as well. Let me ask the first question, and it's kind of a big open-ended question, but what is the biggest challenge that we are facing? What is the biggest challenge that we are facing right now to improve ICANN accountability? Larry, I know you've thought a lot and you've worked a lot on ICANN accountability and the ATRT process, and so I expect you would have some thoughts on what our biggest challenge is on this.
Well, I'd like to react in answering that question to some of the things other folks have said. First off, I think I am not the least bit concerned or worried about the fact that accountability is a very large topic of conversation at ICANN meetings. I think it's extremely healthy for the organization. And I think accountability is one of the hallmarks of the multi-stakeholder process. So nobody should be alarmed by the fact that people want to continue to explore ways to improve accountability. Having said that, I think ICANN, notwithstanding all of the issues people have mentioned, is about the most accountable organization to its community that I've ever been engaged with. In no way does that excuse the community from continuing to find ways to improve processes, to continue to find ways to make the organization work better and be more responsive to the community. But I think it's nothing but healthy that this is an important topic, and people shouldn't be alarmed that, that there's always something we can find or that the community can find to improve ICANN's accountability. In fact, we should worry that the day might come when people would stop saying that, because I think it would mean that the central nature of accountability as being important to the multi-stakeholder process might have lessened in importance, and that would not be good for the organization. So in terms of immediate challenges, I do think that this process that ICANN is and the community needs to get underway to look at what does it mean for the United States to step away from its current role with respect to ICANN, and how does that affect accountability? To the extent that people thought that the United States was the parent in the background who could step in and correct issues if they emerged. First off, I'm not even sure to what extent that's valid or true, but certainly I acknowledge the perception, and I do think that for the community to get its arms around defining that and then determining what needs to be done to replace that value, whatever it was, will be a very, very important and difficult conversation to have, just because it's hard to define exactly what it is that it meant to have ICANN operating under a contract from us that had no money exchange hands, that really had no direct oversight, but which people perceived led to a certain amount of stability in the process that people are worried might be lost when the United States steps aside and allows the contract to expire. So I think that in the near term is probably the biggest accountability challenge facing the organization.
Yeah, thank you. And I think going beyond that, I think when I look at it, I think that on the scales, the redress issue and what you do when something goes wrong, and I think that the power that the NTIA contract had was that you always felt, whether it actually happened or not, that there was always some final redress that was possible. That someone controlled the contract, that there was a place to go, and that someone could make a phone call and perhaps set things moving in a better direction. Now, the degree to which that was true, not true, used or not true, not used, is almost beside the point. It was an impression that many, many people had. But when you look at ICANN at the moment, in many things it is doing quite well. But when it comes to redress, on issues that have gone wrong, there really is very little method of reliable redress. And so I think that going forward, that really is one of the major things that needs to be fixed. Now, in terms of the IANA and ICANN and the IANA stewardship, we've made an assumption in doing all this that if ICANN is accountable enough, then the U.S. stepping aside and the contract allocation is okay. Of course, that presumes that indeed ICANN remains responsible for the IANA function. So one of the things we also have to look at is to what degree are there IANA accountability issues that are in any sense not necessarily separate in the sense that people are using the separability of operations from policy, but are there accountability issues that pertain to the IANA functions, even if ICANN weren't the one that was so, or even if ICANN as an organization were perfect in accountability, are there still issues that one would need to look at? So I think there's also that bit of differentiation that needs to be done.
Thank you, Robin. I think that I raised addressing some interesting points about why we need to engage in this process of accountability. before to come to this panel, I was thinking, well, why we are engaging in this process? What is important? Why is important? Of course, I was asking this question to myself in my role of board member. And the thing is, no matter how accountable is ICANN as an organization vis-a-vis different organizations or governments, nowadays, there's always a need to improve, what we are doing. Ari is taking some interesting points about what we need to do or what we need to think. But what is most important in this process is how we are doing it. We need to engage our community in this process. They know very well, what we need to do, how we need to do it, where we are coming short in terms of solutions to express those ideas and to fix it in the future. Going to your question, Robin, I think that this process is really complex. It's really necessary, but really complex. One of the complexities is that the very own nature of ICANN. ICANN is an organization which is dealing with the IANA functions, but many other functions too, and is measured in different ways. For example, the board of directors, we have fiduciary duties, and if you don't have training in American or common law, you don't have a clue about what is a fiduciary duty. You don't have the extent, or you don't have to know. You don't know how to deal with this concept. For example, ICANN is dealing with international organization and it's measured in that way. ICANN is dealing with the community, and the community is quite diverse. You have a business constituency with some ideas about what accountability means or transparency means. You have human rights defenders, and they have a different opinion about what is the measure or what's the rule that we should apply in terms of accountability, or how this concept needs to evolve. Then you have the technical community with different standards. So dealing with those different areas at the same time with one only concept, which is accountability, it can be complex. And sometimes, it's difficult, to put yourself in the middle of this process and to realize about the many things that we're trying to cover. So I think that that's perhaps the most complex issue on this process. But again, I think that we have a really good opportunity to address this important issue. And the most important thing is to rely on the community, because I think that they have the ideas that we need to apply in terms of improve this whole concept. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to join in?
The only thing I wanted to add is that two of the items that we talked about already that are shining lights, if you will, on accountability are the Ombudsman and the ATRT. And the two things that those have in common is there's no teeth. I mean, you don't have to do things for them. So the board gets the results of the ATRT. You can choose to accept them or not accept them. So I think the challenge and the question is, who is ICANN accountable to for what? How does it get measured? And what are the consequences for failure to be accountable? I mean, that's really what we're trying to define in the whole process. And it may stop at just what the IANA function, what the U.S. government does within the IANA function, but if that's going to include the relationship with the AOC, which includes the ATRT, how does that flow into that? And the scope could get large, or we have to focus and try to keep it something we can digest and in pieces that we can get through. So it's a question of who and what and how do you measure. So.
Sorry, excuse me. Thanks, everybody. Good morning, Chris Despain. Just to be clear, speaking personally and with something of a sore throat. I'd like us to think about considering asking a series of questions about the accountability piece. I acknowledge that there are massive areas that certain parts of the community, or the community as a whole, is uncomfortable with, doesn't like. I'm uncomfortable with the way the GNSO is structured, for example. I think it makes it extremely hard to deal with. But that's got necessarily have anything to do with the US transitioning out of their role. So the question I think we should be asking is, when it comes to looking at accountability, does the US transitioning out of its role have an effect on the piece? So if you think that the reconsideration request process doesn't work, that's fine, but does changing that, does the USG leaving stop you from changing that or have any effect on the way it currently works? To which the answer is, I would say no. It doesn't have any effect. Should it be changed? Yes. Should it be reviewed? Yes. But Larry taking his bag and moving outside of the room doesn't have any effect on that. Pat's just made a really good point about the affirmation of commitment. That is front and center something we should be talking about. The CCTLD world has a thing with ICANN called an accountability framework. These are documents that CCTLD managers sign with ICANN, and they are, cross documents. ICANN commits this, I, the CCTLD manager, commit that. Now think about that for a second. Quite a number of CCTLD managers are actually governments. So there are already governments that are signing documents with ICANN, and they're called accountability frameworks. So we've got mechanisms in place that we can start to use to deal specifically with the areas that are affected by the USG's transition. Everything else is incredibly important, but it's going to be a problem whether they go or they stay. So I put that in a slightly different bucket and say that's going to need to be dealt with. But it doesn't matter whether they're in the room or they're not in the room. It still needs to be dealt with. Whereas stuff like the affirmation of commitment does need to be dealt with. So it is an incredibly wide scope, Pat, but what needs to actually be dealt with for the transition is, I think, is narrower.
Thank you very much. I've got Jordan, and then I've got Milton, and then this gentleman. Oh my goodness, and Aubrey and Steve. Okay.
Thanks, Robin. I think there's a really important point in what Chris has just said that does need to be teased out, which is I would like to agree with him that we should only focus on the accountability issues that are directly caused by the US government leaving. But the problem with that is that the United States government has said that the transition of NTIA stewardship is only going to happen if there's a proposal that has community buy-in, that there has to be some level of consensus. And so the actual realpolitik of the situation is that enough accountability stuff has to be done, that enough of the community can buy into the plan, that it can go ahead. So if there are people who feel that accountability absent the USG is not dealt with adequately, and that may or may not relate to the specific roles the United States government has compared to the overall, I think Paul Toomey called it the political halo effect created by the contract's existence, then there isn't going to be enough consensus to go ahead and the transition won't proceed at all. So that's the messy situation I think that we're actually in.
Thank you. Okay, Milton, you're next.
Hello. Milton Mueller, Syracuse University. So I want to build on what Chris made. I sort of agree with the distinctions that he's making, but I think I have a slightly different angle on them. I do believe that when we talk about routine forms of corporate governance, like the ombudsman and the ATRT process in which the community gets together and says, hey, ICANN, what are you doing right? What are you doing wrong? What needs to be tweaked? I don't think that should be the center of the conversation around accountability at the moment. I think we have to deal with fundamental external forms of accountability. You know, when the business world, the most important form of accountability is competition. If you do something badly, people can leave and go to another provider. ICANN doesn't have that. We believe that we need to have one route. And ICANN doesn't have a voting membership or set of shareholders the way that a typical corporation has. And so again, you have a very strange relationship. And now the most important thing about the current IANA contract is simply that someone can take it away from ICANN. And unless we're talking about a transition process that somehow gives the community the ability to take away the IANA contract and give it to somebody else, I don't think we have accountability, or what I would call accountability. I don't think I would ever be satisfied with any kind of a new accountability arrangement for IANA that simply involves committees looking at ICANN and making noises if they do something badly. I just don't think that's real accountability. So I think the discussion should be focused on how far you go with that, and that when we talk about the tweaking and the ongoing things, Chris is absolutely right. A lot of this stuff could be done with or without the IANA transition. It's independent of the IANA transition. Other parts of it, Jordan is right. If you have a better appeals process, or what Avri calls redress, maybe the community would be more satisfied with certain kinds of IANA arrangements than they would be otherwise. But unless we're talking about, you know, somebody with the external authority to say, yes, you get this, or no, you don't, I don't think we have accountability.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've got, oh my goodness. Okay, I think you were up next, and then I've got Avri, Steve, and I saw Chuck, and oh my gosh. Keep your hands up. Okay, keep your hands up while he goes ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kavus Araste. The issue of accountability during these decades in which internet has been evolved.
Please speak into the microphone.
Sorry?
Could you speak into the microphone, please?
Far? Is better? Yes, that's okay. Yeah. Accountability during these years has been evolved on a piecemeal approach. We add and put bits over the bits to find some piecemeal solutions for the issue. Accountability is not limited to what is currently on board, and that is the transition of the IANA function stewardship to the global community. It has some relations, but the overall accountability is something that we have to deal with quite deeply. What is accountability? Who is accountable to whom and on what? There are some elements in the bylaws. There are some other elements in the affirmation of commitment, but there is no fully structured accountability starting from the policy itself, the policy making, and the policy implementing entities, and the entities to which the accountability should be reported, measured, and reacted. We need to have an overall restructuring of the accountability. It's not an issue that we do it in a day, but we have to have a plan, a program, and a structure how to do this accountability. Accountability is one of the most, if not the first most important elements in the entire process. There are, in views of some people like myself, and other elements which is outside the discussion of this group, but accountability, I think the way we're going to take and continue this piecemeal approach would not get us to somewhere that we're expecting. We have to that overall accountability process to look at, to have the structure to be established, to define who makes the policy, who implements the policy, and who is accountable to what, and how we measure the accountability, and how we redress if there is anything going wrong to that process. These are the important issues that we need to look at the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Avri?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to build slightly on what Milton had said. And the notion of separability is, and the renewal of a contract is sort of a linchpin in this, and I agree. But because so much of the accountability depends on AOC, which depends, on, in a sense, on that linchpin, I don't see how anything can actually be excluded, because we count on the notion that if ICANN accountability falls apart in any sense, then there is a contract that won't be renewed. Once that has been eliminated, then everything basically goes up for grabs. So I understand what you're saying in terms of these are separate issues about ICANN, and I know that people will argue, but the contract doesn't ensure all those things. But the point is, if you looked at the last time, the contract came up for renewal, ICANN put in a first bid, ICANN's response was not good enough, and basically it was not accepted. Now, there were no other applicants of significance, so therefore it didn't move to someone else. But at least to the outside view, it looked like it could be taken away. And it could be taken away for any number of reasons. So one could look at the AOC and sort of say, well, yes, you've had multiple AOCs, you've made multiple recommendations, and all of these issues have not been dealt with. Therefore, before we renew a contract, what are you going to do about that? Once there is no contract, then there really is no leverage left unless everything else has been dealt with satisfactorily. And that's where the balance lies. Now, there's a very strong trend inside ICANN to say, we're not going for that separability. We're going for the contract, basically eliminating the notion of contract, and just the IANA function becomes something that ICANN does. If that becomes the case, which seems quite possible, then we have absolutely no leverage, and it all relies on hope and goodwill. And that's what's difficult to measure.
Thank you, Avri. Steve, you have the floor.
Thanks, Robin. Steve Delbianco with the Business Constituency. And I'd like to ask Larry Strickling to elaborate a bit on a topic that many of you touched on, this notion of limiting the scope of what the community should discuss in accountability as a result of the transition. And that came up yesterday, and Larry, you cited an example that budgeting issues. For instance, the Business Constituency recommended that one of the new accountability mechanisms would be that the community, a permanent cross-community working group, might well approve ICANN's annual budget, as an example. And Larry, you came back and said, well, for instance, budgeting should be something you handle in an affirmation review team. And many of you have pointed to the primacy of the reviews that are done as a result of the affirmation of commitments. And I couldn't agree more. But here we are at the IGF, where things that are bilateral agreements as opposed to multilateral, where one country has a unique position, are typically magnets for criticism. And the affirmation, which is a document I wholly support, is an agreement that is a bilateral agreement. It is between ICANN and one government, the US government. ICANN can quit the affirmation with just a short period of notice. And in many respects, the affirmation itself is a little bit antiquated. It has 2 of the 4 reviews, which were one-time, once-and-done reviews. I'm speaking of the WHO is review and the one we'll do on the new GTLD program.
Actually, that's not true, but
it could be done more? Great. So the affirmation itself, what the Business Constituency recommended is that that should be in scope, because we believe it should be imported into ICANN's bylaws and shouldn't just be a bilateral agreement between the US and ICANN. And moreover, it should become a permanent part of ICANN's DNA. So I cite that as an example, Larry, where as soon as we open the idea of the accountability topics that are in scope for this transition, it's hard to say something that can't be there. As Avri points out, there's the notion of leverage, and if we are looking to impose very tough accountability redress mechanisms, then the board will be inclined to say, no, we're not as interested in it. And that's why we would prefer tough measures, like the community being able to spill the board, the community being able to approve the budget. We want those tough measures to be accepted by the board, and we need them to bring them into the scope of this once and done discussion.
So, to be clear, I'm not setting the scope of the second team. I simply gave my observation, and I think it's much the same as what Chris formulated a minute ago, which is it seems the starting point for this discussion ought to be what are the accountability measures that are impacted by the expiration of the IANA functions contract, and what does the community want to put in place to deal with that. Beyond that, I'm not going to say anything more in terms of what's in or out of scope. The one example you've given, the question I would ask is, where was that proposal last year? That was we spent a lot of time talking about budgeting and finance on ATRT last year. We went to every supporting organization, advisory committee, and I don't think anybody made the proposal you're making now about who ought to be reviewing the budget of ICANN. And it does seem to me that's the kind of thing that could well have been handled last year and is probably more appropriately handled in upcoming ATRT reviews. Having said that, if somebody can find a way, if the community wants to braze it and deal with it now, I'm not in any position to say don't do it, but I'm just urging that the starting point really ought to be the focus on why there's an accountability work stream being put in place this year, since we just spent an entire year on many of these issues last year. I think that answers your question.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think it's clear that the starting point might be those directly impacted, but that is not, you're saying, that is not a limiting factor, and I appreciate that answer.
Yeah, and then on the comments on the affirmation of commitments, I do think that absolutely ought to be, would seem to be a topic people would want to talk about, how to make that more permanent if it needs to be updated. I think that sort of thing's fine. I think it has served the community and the organization well to have these reviews, and it's something that I would certainly like to see continue on, and I hope others in the community feel the same way.
Thank you. Next in our queue is Chuck.
Chuck Gomes from VeriSign. I'm going to be really blunt about the connection between the IANA transition and the general accountability improvements. I fully agree that they could be totally separated. But as soon as we do that, I personally believe that the chances of the board ever approving any external accountability go down to 0 or very close. I hope I'm wrong. I do hope I'm wrong. But I've watched ICANN since its very beginning, very closely, and it has always been the case that protection of the corporation is the #1 priority. And the legal team does an excellent job of protecting that. And I fully expect there to be a fight right down to the end before any significant changes in that governance model to happen. And as soon as we do the IANA transition, I don't have any faith that significant changes will happen. Now, I hope I'm wrong, but I said I'd be blunt, and that's what I'm doing.
Thank you, Rowan. Thank you, Chuck. Let me be blunt too. I think that this is an ongoing process, and nobody knows the future. Well, so I think that we need to respect the process, how it's going on, and I'm certain that there are board members that, including myself, that we are willing to think and rethink how things are going, how we need to go, how the process is. So I will not be really sure about what you are saying, but let's see what happens in the future.
Robin, can I just very quickly respond to Chuck? Do you mind? Just, Chuck, I accept what you say, but if you truly believe that, then you should be advocating that we are not ready for the US government to leave. You should be advocating that there shouldn't be a transition. Because if you truly believe that we're not mature enough to manage our own space without you, the community, using, as I think the word's been used, as leverage of the need to have the USG out of the game, then you don't believe we're ready, and that's what you should be saying, rather than no, we're going to use we're going to use the USG packing its bag and leaving the room to make you do what we want. That, in my view, is a totally unacceptable way forward.
Just as a quick response to that, I think what we're talking about is what needs to be fixed in the current accountability model. I think the proof of the maturity is whether we can actually fix the things within the next year, as opposed to whether there's a sufficient amount of trust today in the model as it exists.
We have processes for fixing things in the current accountability model. What we're setting up here is a process specifically to deal with one event. We have processes. Larry sat on an ATRT2 for 12 months, as did you. That's a process for fixing the accountability mechanisms. Why is what you're saying now, why is what the things you were asking for now not coming out of the function of ATRT2? Why are they suddenly of desperate need because the USG is leaving? I don't understand that. And I won't be told, and I'm not prepared to be told, and I am now speaking entirely personally, I'm not prepared to be told that what I will do as a board member, you don't know what I do as a board member, or what goes on in the private board. Maybe you should, and I acknowledge that would be a criticism, perfectly acceptable. In fact, I said yesterday to several people, what we should do is actually let everyone see the board list for a month, because you might actually be quite surprised. But honestly, Chuck, I'm not prepared to sit here and be told, if you don't trust us to listen to you and do the job that we've been, in my case, elected to do, then we're not ready.
Chris, let me give you two examples where there's mistrust. Just days before the new GTLD process was ready to launch, ICANN staff, I assume with approval of the board, approved a significant change to a community process with regard to registry contracts. That didn't create any trust. Now, more recently, and fortunately this week here at the IGF, we've seen some movement. I can show you, and I won't do it right now, but I have the data with me. Community comments in London and in the 49 comments that were submitted with regard to accountability were largely ignored. I do not think that asking for public comments, picking the ones you like, and I'm not accusing you of this, you know that, picking the ones you like and ignoring the ones you don't like, and then coming up with a plan and saying, this is the plan, we're going to do it, that in my mind, and we can disagree, is not a multi-stakeholder process. So that's why there's mistrust. Now, I think most board members know I have a lot of respect for each of you, and none of this is meant as personal criticism. But that's why there is mistrust, and that's why the community has never been so united in terms of making some changes there. Changes that we believe, and I think you do too, will make ICANN stronger and make ICANN ready to continue its role 10, 20 years down the road.
I just want to acknowledge that I'm not saying there isn't mistrust. I completely get that. That's absolutely true.
Okay, we need to move on. We've got a queue of
with.
about 20 people waiting. So, okay. All right, let me just go through the people I've got in the queue, and then we can say who I'm missing. I've got Jonathan and Jennifer, and then the gentleman who's behind Steve Del Bianco. Yep, you. And then Peter, I believe you were in the queue. No? Okay. Carlos. Yes, the lady in the back there, the other lady in the back there. David Cake. Jordan, Sebastian, this gentleman here. Okay, and who else am I missing? Oh. You're in. And Adam. Okay. Jonathan.
Thank you. Jonathan Zook from ACT, the App Association and the Intellectual Property Constituency at ICANN. I want to follow on what Chuck and Chris and Avri said together and say, in no uncertain terms, ICANN is not ready. If that's what needs to be said in order for the conversation to go forward, I'm willing to say it. The question then becomes is, can it be ready in the time frame that's been set out for us to bring about an IANA transition? But it is without question that ICANN is not ready for that transition to take place. So I mean, maybe that's not what anybody wants to hear or say, but that is the fact. Accountability is not built into the culture of ICANN. It's not built into the processes with which ICANN operates. ICANN has worked very hard to build a culture of transparency. It's worked very hard to build a culture of consensus building and considered policy development, but there's been very little until very recently, and even that's been relatively weak sauce to deal with the issue of fundamental cultural accountability within that organization. So I certainly believe that this discussion about accountability should have started 5 years ago. No question, but it didn't. And events have led us to be on an accelerated time frame to talk about real accountability, and we need not shy away from it simply because we feel like we're on an accelerated time frame. At this juncture, ICANN is not ready for a transition. So the question we all have to ask ourselves is, can we get together and become ready? And in some ways, it's been an inspiring process because there's been more consensus from the internet community since the announcement of the potential of an NTIA transition than there has been in the 8 years that I've been involved with ICANN. I mean, it's amazing to listen to the conversation inside of the SOs and ACs, et cetera, about, hey, you know, maybe it's more important to reach consensus than it is to have every one of our points addressed, for example. I think the community is partly to blame for the problem that's been created because we have used the board as Solomon to split the baby instead of actually doing the work we need to do to build consensus in the first place. And I think that's happened far too often where we've just thrown the decision over the wall to the board and created a culture that isn't particularly accountable. Accountability fundamentally requires people to make commitments that are measurable down the road, being able to look at them later to see if they did what they said they were going to do, and having teeth. So yes, the scope of this can vary limited. It's about giving the community teeth. Every other detail will work itself out if that one change is made. That's all that has to happen in order for there to be the environment that Chuck is speaking of, which to have the minutia of accountability mechanisms and the cleanup and the change of culture that has to take place after the transition. But absent that one reform, we're not ready.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on your name.
Hi, Robin. I'm Olga Madruga-Forte, a member of the ICANN board. I've been listening very carefully to all of the comments regarding the scope of accountability at hand, and soon realized that, of course, we have two accountability dialogues going on simultaneously. That which is related narrowly to the IANA function underlined, and the overall accountability of all parts of the organization, including the GNSO, the board, all of the functioning parts of what comprises this wonderful melting pot of multi-stakeholderism. That is perfectly healthy coexistence of dialogues. If you were to consider that every single piece of improvement of accountability has to occur, be final, and occur simultaneously before there can be any evolution of the organization, either as a whole or a piece of it, then one would implode. It is very important to consider that accountability never ends. Improvements in accountability should never end. That should be an overall and ongoing process as long as the organization, as we know it today, continues to exist. when the U.S. government, and obviously Larry is here, I don't purport to speak to them or for them, when the U.S. government announced that the time had arrived with the maturation of the organization to the point that we can consider transitioning away from the IANA contract, then indeed it is very important to consider those pieces of accountability that relate directly to that IANA function, to make sure that accountability as an element of transition is happening correctly. But I have to agree with my colleagues on the board, which it's not often the case that we all agree on something, that it's very important to look at that issue in its narrow sense, so that we do not implode in this very important process, and consider that every piece of accountability that should be improving into the future always has to happen, which it cannot, by the way, before there can be the continuing transition of the organization as a whole.
Thank you very much. Okay, next in the queue is, yes, the gentleman back there coming, yes.
Good morning, my name is Per Strömbäck. I'm the editor of Netopia.eu. We're a web magazine and think tank on the digital society, and I'd like to start by thanking the panel for such enlightening comments this morning. I'd like to pick up on the point that Jordan Carter made in his opening remark, and about the public interest. And sorry if this runs the risk of changing the topic a little bit, or maybe I should say the wider public interest. In the communication leading up to this IGF, it was said that 4 billion internet users will be online by the end of the year, and that leaves 3 billion users, or 3 billion people, not online. So my question is, as we talk about the internet community and the stakeholders, how do we define those terms? Because I think it's fair to argue that internet development touches the lives also of those who are not yet online to a large extent, not only in developing and least developed countries, but also a lot of the population in the developed countries. The internet impact goes far beyond the technology. So who defines who is a stakeholder, and who speaks for those who are not stakeholders? Thank you.
Thank you. Next in our queue is Carlos.
Okay, I would like to pose a question, and perhaps I think Milton would help me to answer it. And has to do with accountability as well. Is the case of the NRO and the address registries. We have a structure which handles, coordinates address registries. It's the 5 address registries which serve directly the autonomous systems, providing addresses, IP addresses to these autonomous systems. So they are directly accountable to the autonomous systems, indirectly accountable to the consumers of internet services of these autonomous systems. No? The question is, this is running basically smoothly. We don't see in ICANN main panels or tracks discussing what the NRO or the REERs are doing. IP addressing seems to be a solved issue regarding, is one of the IANA set of tasks, no? One of the IANA functions. So in the transition of the IANA function, isn't it that we have in practice already a structure for coordinating IP addressing, which is ready in, say, the new scenario of the IANA functions administration or governance? And the question is that I have, and perhaps Milton could help me. In this case, supposing that the NRO becomes the true coordinating body formally, and in practice it already is, no? Of the IP addressing distribution. How would the question of separability be considered? Like operations is already done by this group of organizations, very well done. And the experience I have with LACNIC, one of the rears, is that the LACNIC is very heavily involved in discussion of policies in a broad sense in Latin America and the Caribbean, with a strong presence of communities which have not directly to do with autonomous systems, but they participate in the discussions. And LACNIC is the main supporter of the regional IGF in our region. And I assume that the other rears have similar presence in their regions in terms of representative and participation. So it's an interesting structure, which I think is ready to go to run one of the functions of IANA, which is IP addressing. It's already doing it. So how to separate operation from policy in this case, if this de facto will be the structure that will run the IANA function called IP addressing in the new scenario?
Milton, did you want to respond to that?
Well, I think the key point is that you're correct. The policy-making processes of the RIRs are separated from the IANA run by ICANN, so that if you want to develop a global policy that guides the global IANA, you have to do a bottom-up process in each of the RIRs, which is then ratified in each one. And the IANA then more or less passively implemented after the ICANN board essentially says, yes, this is a legitimate global policy. And of course, this is precisely what we don't have in the DNS. The DNS is always the problem child of this relationship because everything is mixed up in one entity. So I see that Kuo Wei wants to talk. And
this is Kuo Wei, is also the ICANN board. And actually, as pointed by the ASO, is a number of organizations. I'd like to tell you the difference between the number and the name. First of all the IR, the number organization is a membership systems. In the ICANN, we are not membership system at all. Okay, so this means in most of the IR, the budget need to approve by the member. So fundamentally, these two systems is very different, no matter how they operate it. Furthermore, because on the IR, as you know, we are running with the number systems, and those are number dispute to the the local internet registry. We have to dealing with whatever the people need address, whatever they're from the government or from the industry or from the individual institutions. So I think that is a basically very different. And as you know, because there is a member systems, so that means it's more technical than business in a sense. So it's less struggling regarding for the interest, and so we are more focused on the technical, how to, fairly dispute no matter the IPv4 address or IPv6 address. And as you know, in the last many years, we are continuing to helping to promote IPv6 around the world. And that is what Carl talking about, why the NIC IR is deeply involved to helping the internet policy developing from national, regional, and globally. So I think that is basically the DNA organization is different.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to remind speakers we're running out of time, so if we could keep our remarks really, really brief from this point forward. Okay, so yes, the lady in the back with her hand up. I know you've been waiting. And then Henriette, you're next. Okay, so go ahead.
My name is Geeta Hariharan. I'm with the Center for Internet and Society, India. We are a member of the NCUC of the GNSO. There has been a lot of conversation about parallel tracks for accountability within ICANN and whether ICANN is then ready for the INA transition and for a change in accountability. I'd like to speak to one point that Avery had made and that's been discussed, which is the transparency and enforcement mechanisms within ICANN. Now, I understand that there are many mechanisms for redress and for accountability within ICANN, like reconsideration, the IRP, and the Ombudsman. But as panelists here have discussed, these mechanisms are largely toothless because there are no enforcement mechanisms. I'd like to, my comment is something that we had submitted to the enhancement of accountability process within ICANN, and we feel that this wasn't considered by the panel. So I'd just like to raise it here. I'd like to think of the possibility of a right to information mechanism for the global internet governance community and the ICANN community, where there are designated officers, information officers within ICANN who shoulder personal responsibility for information requests within ICANN. Now, the problem with the documentary information disclosure policy is that it has exceptions that are similar to many private corporations, but this is something that should be reconsidered because ICANN performs a global public function. And under many constitutional regimes, private corporations that perform public functions are held to shoulder responsibilities of states. Marsh versus Alabama is just one example of such cases. So I believe that if we have a system within ICANN where there's an agreement or a charter for an independent appeals panel that ICANN agrees to abide by decisions of the independent review panel, and that is a non-negotiable requirement, with punitive consequences for members of ICANN staff who deal with these requests, this might be a mechanism with greater teeth and enforcement that will ensure transparency within ICANN. I would like the panelists and the community's responses to this consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Henriette, did you want to?
Just quickly, Henriette Esterhuizen, APC. You know, it seems to me that, and I think other speakers have said this, that accountability and participation are very different. And what appears to me to be happening in ICANN, and I'm a little bit of an outsider, is that there's increasing investment in increasing participation and even in internationalization. But I see that as actually just increasing the accountability problems. So without also a process of corporate governance reform, you're actually making the problem greater by being more transparent, being more inclusive, being more participative, opening offices in Istanbul and Singapore and so on. And it seems that the corporate governance reform shouldn't be too complicated because the board has a particular role, it's responsible for the institution at the moment, but by reforming the structure of ICANN, simply by creating a membership layer so that you have a two-tier layer of governance, it would actually be so simple. Because you have constituency structures and community structures within ICANN already. Just empower them by giving them a formal role in the organizational bylaws and making the board then accountable to them. A simple mechanism would be making the membership layer responsible for overall policy and direction, and then the board becomes responsible for making sure that policy and direction set by the members are adhered to, as well as for all those corporate statutory good practice layers. So maybe the problem, of course, is politically difficult, but my own organization is incorporated under Californian not-for-profit company law, and we actually found it a very friendly legislation and not that difficult to create this type of accountability structure.
Thank you very much, Henriette. David.
These are 3 questions from remote participation. All are from Gideon Ropp of .Connect Africa. First question, is it plausible to have an elected position for the public on the ICANN board? Question 2, the ability to have a second shot by the community on the current ICANN activity on its proposed accountability process has been forwarded by the staff members without an initial community input. And question 3, is ICANN too busy to manage all of these processes properly at a go?
Great, thank you very much from the remote participants. Who would like to take a stab at those questions here? Yes, Adam.
Well, we do have a somewhat roundabout kind of way elected member from users, and that is through the at-large process. And there is one member of the board who represents users, not in an elected form, other than through the processes that exist through the ALSs. So that's the way that ICANN has evolved, and users are represented in a somewhat indirect, but represented anyway by a member of the board. So that sort of answers the first question.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to take a stab at that, answering that question? No? Okay. Okay, Jordan, you were up next in the queue.
Thanks. I wanted to come to the question of trust, which was discussed a bit earlier on in these governance arrangements. I quite like the New Zealand government. I generally trust it to do the right thing, but the reason I trust it is because there's a separation of powers. That means I don't have to trust one part of it entirely, because another part can keep that part under constraint. And I think that what a lot of us are saying is that given the general feeling in the community about ICANN today, it isn't enough to say trust us. And that isn't because we don't trust you particularly. We may or may not trust the current status quo, but there's going to be, this organization is not a 2-year or a 5-year gig, right? It's going to be there for a long time. And we should not have to rely on trusting one single group to get things right or not. And that's why structure is an important part of this debate. And it creates a more difficult environment to have the conversation we need to have if we get into a why don't you trust us conversation. That has nothing to do with an accountability discussion.
Thank you. Aubrey, did you want to respond? Or you wanted to get in the queue? Okay, so just the regular queue. Okay, so next we've got Sebastian.
Thank you, Adam, to explain what I wanted to say, but I want to go a little bit further. Yes, I am supposed to be the voice of end user within the board, but I consider end user the one already end user and the future one, and everybody in this planet. It's a little bit too heavy for my shoulder, but in the next 1.5 months, Renalia will take this charge and I will be released. That will be good. I wanted to come to the question of trust. You, the community of ICANN, elect all the board members. All. If you are unhappy with what the non-com is doing, you select the member of the non-com. Then change your member of the non-com to have the good output. If you are unhappy with a board member, don't elect him again. It's what ALAC at large does with me. I was not re-elected. Then I am sure that it's because they were unhappy with me. And I am sure that the one who are not re-elected, that's because that's the one you think as the worst one in the board. Because if not, you will return them. Then take your part of the responsibility in that. The board is a multi-stakeholder body where all the stakeholders are a voice represented. Yes, I know that we have the fiduciary responsibility under the California law, but sometimes we discuss heavily of what the board can do. Then I really think that take the cards you have in your hands, each one of you, and deal with that and not say, oh, the board is bad. No, the board, it's your board. It's coming from you. It's not coming from elsewhere. And I really think that if we take that as first step, then it will be, the discussion will be easier than to say, oh, you are the bad and we are the good, because at the end, we are one single community. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next in our queue, yes.
Thank you. And my name is Wang. I'm from Ministry of Industry and Information Technology of China. I would also give some comments regarding the accountability issues. In fact, the accountability issues is important issues regarding the INR transitions. And so we can give some objective for the INR transitions. I think, the transitions should have two objectives to be considered. One, to make the existing network to change a new one in a smooth and peaceful ways. So, in fact, the present accountabilities just focus these topics. So, all the community, including academic, including technology, including governmental, to give technical and legal discussion on the topics. But ladies and gentlemen, when we considering another objective of INR transitions, I mean the future development of internet, we should have more consideration. I mean, for the coming new 1 billion internet users, maybe most of them will coming from developing countries. But at present, the accountabilities have few consideration on these topics. We should increase the representative of developing countries on the full system of accountabilities. Furthermore, when we're talking about the developing countries, we should also focus on the government functions and the government authorities in the developing areas. But obviously, the present accountabilities also marginalized the function of the government. So China side, we think when we talk about the transitions, when we talk about accountabilities, the developing countries and the government should be more emphasized and should be more encouraged to be involved in the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next in the queue, this gentleman right back here. Been waiting a while. And again, let me remind folks to please keep your remarks to just under 2 minutes because we're already over time. So we'll just go till they kick us out.
Yeah, I'm Sivasubramanian Muthuswamy from Internet Society India, Chennai, and I'm also an at-large participant. I first want to start with a comment from Geeta of India, and she was saying that we should have a mechanism for getting information, a right to information kind of suggestion. When we talk about accountability and transparency, accountability is a process which is way above rules and processes, and we can't have a set of rules and processes and say that we are accountable. You could follow a set of rules, follow all processes, and still could be unfair. I would like to draw an analogy from the business world. One method of certifying product standards is to look at a product and subject each and every instance of the product to a drop test or a immersion test and say that the product can be certified. Another method is the ISO 9000 kind of standards process, whereby the whole organization is evaluated for its propensity to build products of quality. And once that system is inherently there, the quality system is inherently there, one could trust that any product that comes out of that ISO 9000 factory is a good product. So the accountability process in ICANN should be a process whereby we try to build an inherent standards without necessarily placing emphasis on rules or sub-rules. And as an organization, it should be built up as an accountable organization. That's all I would say. Another point, Yesterday, Fadi was talking in the town hall meeting that he was asked to go slow. And for a different reason, for a very different reason, I would agree with the community on the suggestion. ICANN cannot proceed on a pace, assuming that accountability process could come to a whole, could be brought to a whole completion within a span of next 9 months. So it should be an ongoing process, as someone suggested, and it should be a continuous process. So even the consensus that we could give to NTIA could be a consensus that it must be a continuous process. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Avri.
Thank you. While I do want to agree with those that say that we're not ready, I believe it easily could be ready. We easily could be ready, but that requires the board accepting that it needs to accept a binding appeals mechanism. There needs, certainly, I think it's wonderful that the board has a united front and saying that to fix all accountability is impossible. But that's an absurdum requirement that I don't think anyone's asking. What we're asking is that there is at least one method of appeal that is binding, that if things go wrong, there is a method of redress. You know, the point is that unlike the IETF, we can't just say, you know, ICANN's not doing its job, we're leaving. We don't have that option. So given that we don't have that option, you know, we did, and the last thing I wanted to say is that we have to prove over a long time that we are accountable, not only to those that participate, but as people say, to all those that may not even know we exist, but who may be affected by what we do. But we have to have that one method of redress that is binding.
If I could just ask you a question, Avri, to whom is the appeal made and who are they accountable to? How do you avoid creating a new accountability problem?
Appeals mechanisms are those things that are, you know, respected jurist bodies that are established, that are, you know, built up by the community, basically picks and chooses them in some voting method.
Right, but you've then taken a board that is selected by the community, and maybe that process needs to be reevaluated, and you're now collapsing it down to some smaller number of people selected probably by a smaller subset of the community who don't have any accountability to anybody. And I just worry as to, I understand the desire for an appeal process. I understand the desire to go above it, but you have to find a way to do it, and I'm not sure you can, that doesn't create a new set of accountability issues. And I think the record of the independent review process demonstrates that. That first panel made judgments. The key findings of fact at that first panel were based on hearsay that were totally incompetent, and yet that formed the basis of their opinion. That's not a model I think we want to be signing on to for you know, the kinds of issues you are worried about.
Okay, yes, here the blue shirt.
Okay, my name is Sean Ojedeji. I am from Nigeria. I work for a university. I'm participating in this IGF as an ISOC ambassador. I have a comment and two questions actually. My first comment has actually been well mentioned by Sebastian, because I really find it strange that there will be just one at-large, one representative for the so large at-large on the ICANN board. My other second comment is in relation to what Henrietta mentioned, because I really find it concerning that the option of membership, that is the constitution of membership, in order to have something more structured in relation, in a manner similar to the IRR, is not considered. I think the board are full of more experience. They know, after all, board is not a lifetime thing. So I don't see why they are not thinking of these solutions. So long as they are not going to be there for life, they should find a way of fixing this thing properly. And then the last one is, yes, accountability is a a continuous process. It won't end next year. However, I think there should be a possibility of setting milestones that, okay, if we're going to build 4-story buildings, we need to make sure that the 4-story building is done before there could be any transition. We cannot achieve all this at once, but I think there should be clear milestones that should be set, and we should be able to evaluate the process, the progress of the milestones. So if there are no milestones to set and if there are no processes to follow, then I think we'll just write back to the NTIA that we are not ready to take this call. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that I've heard talked about, a possible outcome from today's meeting, is potentially forming an IGF dynamic coalition on this issue of accountability in internet governance and institutions, for example, ICANN. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with what a dynamic coalition is here at the Internet Governance Forum, but basically it's just a group of people from diversity of stakeholders, at least 3 different stakeholders, who recognize there's an issue that they want to work on and focus on, and get together and maybe work through a mailing list over the course of the year and present their findings at the next year's IGF, perhaps a report, perhaps some kind of a watchdog report card function could this dynamic coalition could undertake. So I just wanted to suggest this as a possible outcome and see if there was any thoughts on that before we close. Any thoughts?
You missed me from the list, so if I can come back into the speaking list, because, you know, yeah. No, I wanted to make a point. We talk a lot about the board being accountable and this ICANN being accountable, and I wonder if we sometimes forget that we are also ICANN, so this is the sort of Spartacus moment. And, you know, you look at the at-large, and Sebastian has done a lot of work on this, it is very accountable. The lists are open, everything is recorded, you can see what they're doing, how they're deciding things, and it's very good. The GAC, which we make fun of, only held 2 closed meetings in London. The CCNSO held 5. There's a hashtag just saying on that one. But how about the GNSO constituencies? We're all meant to, according to the bylaws, be open in the best possible way we can be. I was trying to look through some of the open lists, and quite a lot of them don't have open lists. The registries do not have a list. It's TBD, to be decided. The intellectual property constituency doesn't have an open list. The lists that are open, the business constituency has not discussed this issue on their open lists in the last few months. So I don't know how the leadership decides these things, but it certainly isn't an open manner. The ISPs are a few messages, the non-commercials are. This isn't good enough. We can't just try and point at the board and say you are unaccountable. We are unaccountable, and until we fix this, we're really talking, I think, rubbish. And it's not hard to do. Make your lists open, have the discussions in, you know, open lists, and share this information. Otherwise, it's a farce. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Adam. Okay, I'm going to have to bring this session to a close. I want to thank all of our panelists and participants. This was a really great, engaging session. If anyone is interested in forming a dynamic coalition, please send me an email. My email address is robin, R-O-B-I-N, @ipjustice.org, and I will put together a mailing list and get some discussion going from a coalition of the willing. So thank you all very much.
Did everything